August 2017. A brutal crackdown begins in Myanmar's Rakhine state, triggering a mass exodus. Hundreds of thousands of Rohingya Muslims are forced to flee. Many say they faced murder, torture and rape at the hands of Myanmar's security forces. The Myanmar government says the army operations were conducted against Rohingya terrorists who had staged deadly attacks on dozens of police outposts. Most Rohingya fled to Bangladesh and found shelter in the overcrowded refugee camps around Cox's Bazar. For 3 years, attempts to repatriate large numbers of Rohingya back to Myanmar have failed. Now the global spread of the coronavirus has made that goal even more complicated. Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've closed the repatriation centres for now. We're always open to repatriation, but the centres are closed, and the repatriation efforts have been halted for now. Observers say the situation in Rakhine State is still too unsafe to start sending refugees back to their homes.
I think the idea of repatriation to Myanmar at the moment is very misguided. It remains a perilous situation for Rohingya in Myanmar. There are still around 500,000 Rohingya living in villages in Rakhine State. They're confined to their villages. They're still confined to camps further south in the state. This isn't the context in which repatriation can occur. What's happening on the ground in Rakhine State at the moment is severe restrictions on movement indicate what would befall those Rohingya who return to the state. I think the threat of violence towards Rohingya is still very high.
Even before the huge influx of 2017, Bangladesh had been hosting Rohingya refugees for decades. More than 1 million now live in the sprawling, makeshift camp in the most densely populated refugee settlement on the planet. Officials estimate that tens of thousands are now squeezed onto every square kilometre here. To reduce the population pressure, Bangladesh now wants to relocate 100,000 refugees to the island of Bhasan Char.
Bhasan Char is ready to accommodate 1 lakh refugee there, and the place is well equipped, and they well equipped with 24 hours electricity supply, then sufficient drinking water supply. Then the place of their residence is much more better than that of the Cox's Bazar refugee camps.
But human rights groups oppose the relocation plan. They argue that the low-lying island is prone to natural disasters and is not suitable for long-term habitation. Bangladesh's government insists the relocation of Rohingya Muslims here will only be temporary.
Repatriation is our number one priority. Number one priority for repatriation. You see, whatever we do everything keeping in mind to have the repatriation arrangement, and sending Rohingya people to Bhasan Char. That doesn't mean that it will stop the repatriation. That doesn't mean, because it is just a relocation, just a displacement of the place, nothing else, a temporary shipment. And if the repatriation, when the repatriation will occur, even we can send these Rohingya people from Bhasan Char to Myanmar also.
Relocation or repatriation. 2 options fraught with risk and uncertainty for Myanmar's Rohingya refugees.
Joining me now from Geneva is spokesperson of the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, Mr. Andrei Mahecic. Mr. Mahecic, welcome to DW News. Bangladesh keeps insisting that repatriation of Rohingya refugees to Myanmar is its #1 priority. I'm wondering how the UN sees it.
Well, first and foremost, the repatriation is a preferred solution for most of the refugees. And in fact, this is the key point. We should be listening to what the refugees are saying. And the refugees themselves are saying that they wish to return, as is the case in many other refugee crises in the world. However, for this repatriation to become a reality, there will need to be some improvements on the ground in Myanmar. The repatriation needs to be, first and foremost, a voluntary one. It needs to be a decision taken by the refugees themselves on the basis of good information about the situation back home, about what they can expect in terms of conditions. So what we would need to see is the lifting of the restrictions on the, for example, freedom of movement. We would need to see access to livelihoods, to jobs. We would need access to education also being granted. Also, a pathway to citizenship is something that the Rohingya refugees have repeated many times as one of the key conditions for their return. So, in a nutshell, we should be closely listening to what the refugees themselves are saying.
Yeah, but the refugees are saying they want to go back, but they want safety and security. And as you seem to be putting it, the onus is on Myanmar to provide that safety and security. Do you see the Myanmar government working actively to improve the plight of Rohingya refugees?
Well, right now we have been calling for a while for resumption of the dialogue, first and foremost between the Myanmar authorities and the refugees themselves. This is a very important element in building that trust that will be necessary for the refugees to make their decision. As we have said many times, the responsibility for creating conditions conducive to return of refugees lies with Myanmar government. It lies also with the recommendations of the Rakhine Advisory Commission, to which the Myanmar government has committed itself.
Correct. But I'm sorry to interrupt you, sir, but is the Myanmar government living up to that responsibility?
I was just coming to that point. Myanmar is currently engaged with both UNDP and UNHCR, the UN refugee agencies, in working on where the two agencies are helping Myanmar to start creating the conditions conducive for the return of refugees. But in the meantime, we should not forget that currently we have an ongoing conflict in the Rakhine state. There is a fighting going on between Arakan army and the Myanmar military. The estimate is that it has displaced more than 86,000 people since the beginning of the year. Right. And there are issues with the landmines. There is issues with the constant insecurity. So this is another element that also needs to be addressed, and a peaceful outcome of that situation is also necessary before we can talk about the safe and sustainable and dignified return of the Rohingya. There are also 130,000 Rohingya who are internally displaced in Rakhine, they also need solutions.
Right, but they're not just internally displaced. I mean, I'm just quoting what Human Rights Watch said in a recent report. They said that the Rohingya and Rakhine state are living in appalling conditions. They are confined to camps and villages without freedom of movement and cut off from access to adequate food, medical care, education, and livelihoods. So this goes beyond the conflict in Rakhine. This is an attitude, it would appear, of the Myanmar government towards the Rohingya Muslims living in Rakhine state. Do you see a change in the future in that attitude of the Myanmar government?
As I said, there is a work going on helping Myanmar to create the conditions for the return. There will need to be an improvement on the ground, in the conditions on the ground, with the lifting of the restrictions on the freedom of movement for these people, their ability to go back to their own villages, their ability to have access to jobs, to work, their ability to get education. But most importantly, the key condition that has been put forward, especially by the Rohingya community, is a clear pathway to citizenship.
We'll have to leave it there for the time being. Andrei Mahecic, spokesperson of the UNHCR. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. And that's it for today. There's more on dw.com/Asia and on Facebook and Twitter. Now, the Rohingya tragedy often devolves into numbers. The more than 700,000 who fled Myanmar, the nearly 500,000 who are still in the country dealing with restricted freedoms. But behind each figure is a face that's been dealing with statelessness and a struggle for basic existence. We leave you now with some of these faces that define the continuing saga of this people. We're back tomorrow. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.